Good morning, Williams College community. My name is Abed Togus, and I am a student here at Williams. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to today's keynote address and morning keynote speaker as part of this year's Claiming Williams Day. But before we commence, I will read the Stockbridge-Muncie Community Land Acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Muncie Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship, after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. This year's Claiming Williams theme is access to and through higher education. Today we are reminded of the transformative power of education, but also how imperative it is to ensure equitable access to education for all members of our society. I hope that I and the broader Williams community will take this opportunity to engage in deep learning and unlearning as we understand our role and position here at this institution. Even after today, I hope that such talks remain at the forefront of our minds as we go on about our lives. Today, we are joined by our morning keynote speaker, Aaliyah Bilal, whose debut collection of short stories, Temple Folk, recently became a finalist for the 2023 National Book Award for Fiction. Born and raised in Prince George's County, Maryland, Bilal has degrees from Oberlin College and the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Bilal writes both in fiction and nonfiction, and her work centers the Black American Muslim experience and stories that connect Chinese and Afro-Diasporic peoples. In line with our theme of access to and through higher education, Bilal's talk is titled Education and Opportunity Beyond the Gates. In closing, I want to thank the Claiming Williams Steering Committee for making this event possible. And I want to send a special thank you to the Bear family, who have generously supported Claiming Williams for years through the Bear Family Fund for Diversity and Inclusion. Now, please join me in welcoming Aaliyah Bilal and giving Aaliyah Bilal a warm Claiming Williams welcome.
Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. I'm so honored and happy to be with you today. Can you hear my baby voice? I have an itty bitty bitty voice sometimes. I'm so happy to be with you today. I want to start by offering my thanks to Clinton Williams, to Carrie Green, and to everyone who worked so hard to make my visit with you possible today. It's a great honor to be with you on this day, celebrating Claiming Williams Day on the first day of Black History Month. When I was younger, I used to think of this month as a time to celebrate the battles that had been fought and won toward creating racial equity in American society. Now I feel, as many of you perhaps feel, that those battles were not won, but merely abandoned for a time. That now many of us are thinking of the civil rights struggle not as part of the past, but as something that remains an essential component of our praxis as a people whose voting rights continue to be curtailed, who, due to medical racism, suffer the highest maternal mortality rates in the country, low wages, high incarceration rates. The list goes on and on. So we savor the opportunity to gather in the hopes of creating beloved community. I've been trying to imagine what it would feel like if I were still myself, but an undergraduate at a school like Williams. That is to say, a cerebral, creative, politically progressive, African-American Muslim woman from the urban working class. And to be a student at an institution like this at this time. I wonder how my class background would set me apart, how my religious identity would set me apart. I wonder how it would feel maintaining friendships across the various divides of race, class, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. How could I persuade my peers across these divides that I see their struggles too? Most of all, how would I cultivate a sense of hope that despite the challenges I imagined that I would face at a school like this, that I could rise above it all, find community, and ultimately leave this place feeling prepared for the working world? I had a hard enough time when I was an undergraduate on a campus that was very, very politically progressive, where you couldn't turn a corner, walk down the street without somebody asking you, "Have you taken a moment to interrogate your privilege today?" As a campus, we were very, very observant of the rules of political correctness. I don't know that your generation even uses that term anymore. We were trying to be equitable in word and in deed. Given what I know about the impetus for the founding of Claiming Williams Day, I cannot help but think I would have had a hard time here, especially at a moment like this. It's not just about life on campus for Black students or students from minority backgrounds, but life in our local communities, in our country, and in the world. In this time, it feels like the stakes are so much higher. I remember when I was a freshman and George W. Bush was declared the winner of the 2000 election, even though Al Gore had earned more votes. The night it happened, my roommate kept me up because she was crying and crying and crying about it. Then came the attacks of September 11th, and then the start of the US war in Iraq, and then Hurricane Katrina. And we were all so sure that life in America could never, ever, ever get worse than it was then. The forces we confront today are bolder, much less concerned about causing offense, and unapologetic in their antagonism toward the vulnerable. Even so, we raise our voices in spite of the trends, trying to stake a claim in a country where confidence about the future is on the decline and pessimism is on the rise. I vacillate between a grave view of our direction as a country and a point of view that questions why I should take the destiny of this country seriously when it only grants me and people who look like me a kind of provisional citizenship. I can have an American passport, but I may live in a gerrymandered district and face unjust delays in order to vote. I can fly the flag, but the water in my neighborhood may contain disproportionate amounts of lead. I wonder if it is because of all the things that I am, that I've never really felt I belonged to this country. I've traveled the world and have come to accept that I am an American. I have American ways of seeing and of being. This, to me, is not the same as belonging. Belonging is not just about the claims we make on a given space, but the way these spaces claim us back. The way they acknowledge, respect, and celebrate us. And in my case, particularly as a Black Muslim, I've never felt seen in this culture, much less claimed as an integral part of the nation. What I will try to do today is to talk about my development as a writer, how I pursued an unconventional path to publication, and the resonances with conversations we are having today about the spaces Black people occupy in American institutions. I hope my words are useful, particularly to those of you who feel called to a life of creative work. In many ways, I feel that I was cut out for a life on the periphery, outside looking in, not so much because of my color, but because of my religion. When I think about the images that are available within the American imaginary of Black religious life, most make reference to the centrality of Protestant Christianity to the African American story. In our literature, television, film, and various other media, images of Baptists, Methodists, and Pentecostal Christians dancing in the sanctuary, clapping and singing their praises to God are the most abundant. So that for me, growing up in the mostly silent and staid atmosphere of the Friday Jummah, I didn't see my experience reflected back to me in the broader culture, but there was this added element of alienation. Not only was I Muslim in a culture where I felt invisible, in prior generations, my family had also been members, get ready, of the Nation of Islam. When I was a kid, this was a fact that was rarely spoken about within my family. I would come to learn that this was mostly because, for my aunts and uncles in particular, their experiences within the nation were very traumatic. And so no one wanted to revisit those memories. The family had become Sunni, leaving behind Elijah Muhammad's ideology with its inverted racial hierarchy, but the identity was still there. This organization, which is perceived by many in our world, not entirely without reason, as bid'ah in the Muslim world, meaning it espouses a frowned-upon theological innovation within Islam. And in the West, it is perceived as spreading racial and ethnic discord. I was not only invisible in this culture, I also felt like a pariah. It must have been this combination of feeling invisible and feeling like an outcast because of my family's religious past that from an early age I began to divest. I began to divest my identity from America, to question the reflexively reverent posture many Americans take toward its cultural, legal, and social norms. There were a series of happenings in my life that made me see how invisible I was and solidified my trajectory away from the mainstream. despite the popularity of hip hop, despite the celebrity of people like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. It seemed to me that this movement that gave us all of these, this movement that was part of my personal legacy, was greatly and even purposely misunderstood. It was in the early 1990s, ancient times to many of you in this room, when this new TV show in living color first aired. Yeah, it was a sketch comedy show on par with Saturday Night Live, save that the cast was predominantly Black, and it was focused on exaggerated tales taken from Black urban working class life. I will never forget the evening with my family gathered around the TV when this character, Oswald Bates, appeared on our screen. He was seated in a blue button-down shirt with a colorful kufi on his head, similar to the ones my father wore for Friday Jummah prayers, a clear reference to Mr. Oswald Bates' identity as a Muslim. Immediately, he began to speak, and I want to caution you. The words I'm going to share with you are very, very deep, so pay close attention. First of all, we must internalize the flatulation of the matter by transmitting the effervescence of the Indonesian proximity in order to further segregate the crux of my venereal infection. Now, if I may retain my liquids here for one moment, I'd like to continue the redundance of my quote-unquote intestinal tract. See, because to preclude on the issue of world domination would only circumvent, circumcise the revelation that reflects the aphrodisiac symptoms which now perpetrates the Jerry curls activation. My family listened to this sketch, and from the first nonsensical utterance, we all burst into laughter, our laughter growing even louder as the frame widened to reveal Oswald Bates seated in a prison cell. It made me laugh, and honestly, it still makes me laugh. But there was a slow realization that Oswald Bates was a stand-in for people like me. Sometime later in 1992, the film Daughters of the Dust was aired on my local public broadcasting station. It is a beautiful film by Julie Dash, and a film that helps shape the visual world of Beyonce's formation, if you've ever seen that. And it's a film about a family that's leaving the Georgia Sea Islands at the turn of the 20th century, heading on its way to the north. In the film, there was a character named Bilal Muhammad. In contrast to Oswald Bates, who was drawn as a buffoon, the depiction of Bilal Muhammad was beautiful and dignified, with the caveat that he had nothing to say about himself. The images were beautiful, but there was an emptiness that I felt in his depiction. It wasn't true in the end that we were invisible in American culture. No. We were not invisible. It's just that we were imagined as poor imitations of Malcolm X on the one hand, prone to criminality and intellectually feeble, or on the other hand, merely beautiful ornaments in other people's stories. It's curious in this regard that I would find myself standing before you on Claiming Williams Day at a time in our culture where there's heightened scrutiny around the place that we as Black people can occupy in all kinds of institutions, particularly as students, administrators, and faculty within higher education. In the ways that I'm known in the world, my journey has been about venturing out, seeking opportunities beyond the gates, so to speak, in the furtherance of my vision. The first part of the story, which I've already told you, is what I refer to as the start of adventure. This was the phase of my life when the questions that motivate the work I do today were awakened in me. Then came the work of merging my interests with my walk of life, or the ways I reconciled the demands of the world with my emerging identity as an outsider and an artist. Some of this way of living in the world has to do with my personality. Perhaps because I felt misunderstood and outcast. From a very young age, I developed a habit of retreating into the self. That's a habit I'm sure many in this post-COVID generation can relate to. To me, it was more like a feeling of being overtaken by inner visions, too much to care about the outside world. This is not unique. And everybody can relate to the feeling of seeing the beautiful and sometimes hideous images that float just behind your closed eyelids. It's different, though, when the physical world starts to go dark and the imagination begins to feel more real than reality itself. As a kid, I would sit in class trying to concentrate, then I'd see these pinwheels turning in my head. All eyes would be on me. And the teacher would call my name, and I'd blank back into reality. Leah was blacking out again. I was not a person who ever completely agreed with the ways teachers wanted us to process information. It seemed like they were trying to structure our minds into a grid, where we'd forge these little pockets where we could store and retrieve information. But I had a masticating mind. It was always bending things. It didn't want to give the information back in the same shape it came in. My mind wanted to chew it all up and turn these inputs into something new. My interactions with institutions in this society was mostly through school, in relation to my mental tendencies toward a mild form of dissociation. It made it hard to feel these were the right settings where I could excel, and when I was in school, I was really just going through the motions. So there I was, in my mid-20s, having gone through grade school, college, and having just finished a master's degree, and I was starting to feel overwhelmed with this knowledge about myself. I'd finally accepted that my brain had its own way of processing information, and there was very little I'd experienced in my formal schooling that helped me develop the unique capacities of my own mind. I was in London and I just completed this degree. I was standing on Westminster Bridge, and I'm sure many of you have been there. It's the bridge that runs right alongside the UK Parliament. And these feelings were just at their peak. I'd spent all of my life conforming to the demands of institutions that in the end had alienated me from myself. It was in this moment of crisis that I was visited by the attendant spirit, or my own genius. Everybody has this. It didn't speak to me, but it showed me a series of images in that very moment, infused with a quality that permeated my bones, the drive to render the images I saw into words, and the confidence that carrying out this work was entirely within my abilities. It was a transcendent moment where something beyond what I'd known of my own nature was made clear to me. This invisible entity no one else could see but me. An entity I could tame and harness and make conform to my will. And this was the moment I came alive in the world. I wasn't going to be this academic that my training had made me. I was going to be a writer. Institutions had introduced me to important forms, grammar and usage, to foreign languages. But it was my own imagination, a deep inward knowing that gave the tools I'd accumulated in school their utility and gave me my purpose. This was a moment of epiphany in my life, but inconveniently, as tends to happen, it arrived at a point when I was out of time, in a sense. That is another lesson that I was learning. While I may not have particularly enjoyed my formal education, being in school, particularly my undergraduate and graduate school years, gave me time away from the world to think about things of a lofty nature. Of course, it would happen that I'd discover my life's work at the very moment that life itself was thrusting me into a realm of mundane concerns, like how was I going to feed, house, and clothe myself? This is the part of my story I call entering the school of hard knocks. The process of turning oneself into an artist is unusually demanding. For the artist, the work, the need to think about the work, research and excavate the work from the imagination becomes a totalizing force in one's life. It's hard to overstate the cost one pays on this path. Some of you may be on your way to becoming artists and not even know it. Maybe right now you think you're going to be a dentist or a lawyer or a teacher, but one day you find yourself seized by similarly totalizing visions, and you feel compelled to bring them into reality. I'm excited for the work you're going to produce, but I carry with me the awareness that this is not a glamorous life. The path is terribly steep, and the cost is just painfully high. Many people give up along the way because, among other things, creative community does not always feel like a safe space. When you step your foot into the pool, prepare yourself for a life of judgment and rejection, of thievery from less talented, more desperate peers, and most perniciously, how often these abusers come disguised as friends. But mostly, you will face very harsh judgment that will test your self-belief. In my case, it took me about 3 years to teach myself just how to read like a writer. Then it took another few years before I produced anything that felt worth sharing. I remember when this first happened for me, and I told a friend that I'd written my very first successful short story. And being the wonderful friend that she is, she organized a little salon for me in her Harlem apartment. She invited all of these people to her home. Some of them were already established artists. And I felt so important. As you can imagine, I was very nervous, but also I felt confident that the work that I was sharing with them was at least the very best I'd produced until that time. There was a large group of people gathered around as I read, and it took me about 20 minutes to finish. I was probably halfway through the story, though, when a man who's become a very famous poet in this country laughed out loud. The story had some humorous elements, but he wasn't laughing at the punchlines. He was laughing at my craft of fiction. He was laughing at me. During the questions that followed, he addressed me with great contempt, nitpicking everything about the story. And I knew that in his eyes, I was in over my head. I left the salon that evening feeling that I had been assessed as a wannabe, a person with no real literary talent, with no possibility of ascending in the daunting world of publishing. There was a moment that night where he tried to seem sympathetic. "Why don't you just get an MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts?" he asked me. I took that in, but I'd already exhausted my money going to grad school. I didn't see myself as having any options but to teach myself how to write. So I walked away that night deeply hurt, and it took me months and months to recover from the blow. These are the kinds of interactions that await you on the path. Those that do best develop a healthy disregard for the naysayers, being cautious to distinguish these types from the kinds of people who offer constructive criticism. A good critic helps the artist improve and broaden their vision. You know you've been in the presence of a detractor because you leave them feeling beaten up, whereas a critic helps shape the mind in a way that accommodates growth. So without an MFA and without much support from anyone, I consulted the books themselves. Books have always been my greatest teachers. So I spent my time with my head down, building myself up. From the time of my postgraduate epiphany to landing the deal for Temple Folk, I spent 14 years in the wilderness, teaching myself, hoping against the odds that this work that I was cultivating would somehow make a way into the world. I look back and have drawn some conclusions about the various advantages of pursuing a writing life in this way. By stepping outside of the system, I was able to minimize my exposures to detractors. Aside from a few incidents like the salad in Harlem, I was cocooned in my own loving and accepting embrace, where I could allow my talent to unfurl at its own pace. I also came to appreciate that by pursuing self-study, I'd minimize the influence that institutions often wield over our thought processes and intellectual output. I think it is because a lot of my writing focuses on religion that I see things this way, that institutions tend to evolve their own orthodoxies. Oftentimes, the people operating inside of these orthodoxies think that their ideas are pure and right and superior. Just as often, however, the people outside the system see these orthodoxies for what they are, how narrow and provincial they can be. Teaching myself how to write saved me from excessive contact with detractors and protected me from the institutional orthodoxies that often alienate artists from their own voices. It has been a long path, and the climb is not over. I don't know that a serious writer ever feels that they've arrived. What I do know is that I feel good about my efforts. I know that this work is done with integrity and deep respect, and I know I'm worthy of the spaces I now occupy and worthy of the company of people who are also pursuing greatness. This part of my story is called success. It is not about money or fame. These things for the artist are not very easy to come by. And a lot of people that you know have a lot of money and they are not happy. It is about the feeling you have when you are thoroughly proud of the way you are living in the world. That is my definition of a successful person. I look at the story I've just told you from my own life and gather that, in my own estimation, I'm a self-made woman. There were many obstacles, many points of alienation, lots of detractors, and very little help. The things I've attained were not given to me. I did the work. I met the bar. I pursued a path outside the system and honed a craft of writing that met my own standard of literary merit. At the same time, and even though I do not have deep feelings of belonging in this country, I'm well aware of all of the networks that have helped me achieve what I have achieved thus far. I have a loving family. I attended public schools where the teachers and the staff did their best. Thanks in part to affirmative action, I went to college. Yet despite these institutions and the many social programs and legal norms from which I've benefited, I was never mistaken that the onus was always on me to make good on the investments that had been made in my life. I am not mistaken. The majority of African Americans are not mistaken about the rigors on the path to success. In the same ways that few Americans who benefited from the GI Bill, from the institution of Social Security, from legal norms like the 5-day work week and child labor laws, do not feel self-conscious about the benefits they derive therefrom, neither do I. We can benefit from systems, from social programs and legal norms. We, in fact, need these systems. But we do not have to become artists to understand that these systems can only get us so far. Also, we cannot and should not think it's reasonable to expect people to have to bear the weight of these challenges alone without networks, without support. Robust and inclusive institutions help ensure more success for more people. I'm proud of my story, but acknowledge it's an aberration, it's a rarity. Whatever our race, whatever our passions, medicine, mathematics, early childhood education, we fail ourselves when we refuse the call to the adventure, the call to realize our full human potential. And yet, we let this culture gaslight us into thinking we've taken more than we deserve. A new eugenics has overwhelmed our political discourse in ways that recapitulate an old idea that people who look like me lack the stamina and the aptitude to merit a seat at the table in our institutions. These voices grow louder and louder by the day. They paint people who look like me as unfit to be president of the United States, to be president of elite institutions of higher learning. They've even started to question whether or not we're smart enough to pilot commercial aircraft. They paint the companies attempting to recruit people who look like me, not as expanding opportunities across race, but lowering standards. Where is all this headed? I write literary fiction, so you have to forgive the darkness of my vision. But do the people who make themselves the mouthpieces for these anti-inclusive discourses want to see us return to the plantation? Let me say that again. Do the people who make themselves the mouthpieces of these anti-inclusive discourses want to see us returned to the plantation? Do they want to see us bound in chains? Or maybe they want us finally silenced. Where does the anti-diversity rhetoric end? We look at history and learn not to underestimate the ways that social innovation has led humanity to unconscionable solutions, leading to devastating outcomes on a massive scale, especially for vulnerable people. I know I'm not the only person feeling this. These are the things I think about in these times. I've been so consumed with the troubles of the world. Not really spiraling, just feeling the weight of everything. I have to snap myself out of these moods because my mind returns to an idea that I hope motivates you too. I want to survive all of this madness. I want to be an agent of the good, helping to realize a diverse and equitable future. So what do? I call my sister, we hang out, we make dinner, we sing 90s R&B, we do our little 90s dances. I hug my niece, I make donations, I take long walks. That is my little meditation for you. To those who fight for liberty, for equity, for justice, I wish you peace and strength in the struggle. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to take a few questions if you have any.
Thank you for being here. I am also a child of the first, resurrection within the Nation of Islam, and I've always wondered about my mother also is part of the Black Church. My father was part of the Nation Mother Black Church, so I lived in both worlds, and I struggled with that identity of religious acceptance as the Protestant church. I grew up in that. I knew the benefits of it, but also my father as the outcast, the outsider. So I carry both of those within me. I find though that dynamic true in the American mindset, the American American imagination of itself as one who has enslaved the people and then fought for their liberty and freedom and then re-enslaved them in other ways. And we are still, living out that kind of, recycling. And that dichotomy of belonging, not belonging. Are we American? Are we not American? Am I Christian? Am I Muslim? Do I belong or do I not belong? My question to you, in that what I think at the age of like 52 that I've arrived at, is that's a part of the secret of why I am here doing the work that I'm doing. And it's part of my power. It's a part of a superpower that only comes through that struggle. Nobody really understands and really feels it and sees it. People are intimidated by it, and really, but it comes through what you were talking about, those 14 years of just struggling and toiling and staying committed to who you are. So I appreciate you on that level, because that's a real force. And I'm wondering, I was talking to Ruth Simmons last night, and I believe in this era that we're going into now, we're on the downturn, it's about to swing a whole nother way. It's people like us, though, that are absolutely what America needs to get by, to get through this next phase. What we live and have within us is essential for the survival of this nation. And I'm wondering if you affirm or you agree.
Well, I would like to reiterate what was said. Yes, ma'am, I'm going to reiterate what was stated. There was a comment made, basically talking about our shared background as people who've come through this first resurrection Nation of Islam experience into Sunni Islam, and how that unique cultural background prepares us to take on the challenges of an America where anti-diversity is becoming popular. And it was more of a statement than a question, but a question was asked in the end as to whether or not I agree that we are uniquely prepared to take on these challenges. And I don't know how I could disagree with that. I hope, though, that, the question for me isn't so much whether or not we, you and I, are prepared, but do other people who don't share our background see these trends too? And what is their stake in ensuring a diverse and equitable future for all of us? Because it's not just about, that's my own identity. I'm a Black Muslim woman, but it is about the safety that queer Muslims feel. It is about the safety that transgender Latinx people feel. It is about the safety that Ethiopian Jews feel. It is about the safety of Israelis and Palestinians. It is about everybody understanding that we share this planet, and it's not more one person's than anybody else's. How are we going to share this planet and make sure that everybody has the tools they need to be healthy, happy, and safe? And that's really the question I'm asking. What is everybody's stake in this? How can we organize across our differences to make an equitable future possible for everyone? Okay.
Yeah, hi. I'm very curious about your process as an artist. And you said in your presentation, I think you said you spent 3 years learning to read for a writer. And I'm curious who you were reading, or what does that mean to learn how to read as a writer? If you'd speak a little bit on that.
Absolutely. I will reiterate the question. The question was, how did I teach myself essentially how to read as a writer as opposed to the way I had been reading, which was just as somebody who's entertained by the written word. I think the best way to animate that challenge is to think about yourself watching a magic trick. If you see someone take the card and then they pull it from behind your ear, you're dazzled. How did they do that? How did they do that? You are being manipulated in that moment. But some of the people who are watching the magic trick think, I want to learn how to do that too. And it's a different process of watching for that person, pardon me, than for the person that's just content to be dazzled. And so I was no longer willing to allow these masterful writers to manipulate me anymore. I wanted to learn how the magic trick was done. And so it took a lot of, it just took a lot of time for me to start to see these people as just people and not gods. I think I had this notion of the writer as someone up here and I was down here. And it just took me a while to realize, oh, this is what they're doing. It demystified the process to me. So it was a 3-year process of really putting myself on the other side of the equation. Some people probably doesn't take that long at all, but for me, it was a pretty long process. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Anybody else?
Can we broaden that understanding of reading and think about how we read society, how we read the everyday? So more than just reading the text, but how we read social, political issues in the world, in America, help us understand how we can read closely.
Yeah, so there was a statement really about this idea of reading, and not just the literal reading of text, but reading society and reading the world. How would I interpret that? You know, I spent most of my adult life in China, and I think it's the perspective that I bring to American society, having lived in an autocratic country, that helps me read American society. I think what was essential for me in developing this ability to sort of understand was stepping out. How do you get perspective if all you've seen is what's inside the fishbowl? You gotta kind of leap out. And I think that's such a huge part of learning how to read a society, is just understanding that it's a made thing. It's not something we have to take for granted, whose structures are just inherent, that we devise these things and we can reshape and reform them to meet our needs. Yeah. I will take one more if there are any questions. If not, then I'm happy to meet you afterwards. Okay. Thank you so much.